The frozen winds of Kithara howled across the crystalline landscape, carrying with them the scent of death and desperation. Alpha Vorthak pressed his massive frame against the ice ridge, his 6 powerful limbs gripping the frozen surface as he surveyed the valley below. His pack had been hunting for 3 rotations now, following the trail of the lost cubs through the endless white wasteland that stretched beyond the territorial boundaries of their ancestral hunting grounds. The Karathi were apex predators, evolved over millions of cycles to dominate the frozen worlds of the Outer Rim. Standing nearly 4 meters tall on their hind legs, with thick midnight black fur and razor-sharp claws that could tear through reinforced steel, they were feared throughout the galaxy. Their species had conquered 17 star systems, subjugating lesser races through sheer physical dominance and pack coordination that bordered on telepathic. Vorthak's amber eyes, each the size of a human fist, narrowed as he caught a familiar scent on the wind. His cubs, alive. The relief that flooded through his massive chest was almost overwhelming. For 3 days he had feared the worst. The hunting party that had taken his offspring during the territorial dispute should have killed them immediately, according to Karathi law. Young from defeated alphas were never allowed to survive, as they represented future challenges to the new pack order. But something was wrong. Mixed with the scent of his cubs was something else, something alien and strange, a smell he had encountered only once before, during the brief and violent first contact between his species and the creatures that called themselves humans. The encounter had lasted mere minutes before the humans retreated, but their scent had burned itself into his memory, sweet and salty, with undertones of metal and something indefinable that made his predatory instincts both sharpen and hesitate. He signaled to his hunting pack with a low rumble that carried across the ice. 20 of his finest hunters emerged from concealment, their forms barely visible against the white landscape until they moved. These were veterans of countless hunts, warriors who had followed him for over a decade of conquest across the frozen moons of the Kithara system. Each was capable of taking down prey 10 times their size through pack coordination and savage determination. The trail led down into a deep canyon where the ice had formed natural caves and overhangs. Ancient geological activity had created a maze of tunnels and chambers that provided shelter from the eternal storms that raged across the planet's surface. It was here that desperate creatures often made their final stands, using the terrain to their advantage against larger predators. Vorthak had cornered many enemies in similar places over the years. As they descended into the canyon, the scent trail became stronger and more complex. His cubs were definitely here, but they were not alone. The human smell was overwhelming now, along with something else that made his hackles rise. The acrid tang of fear, but not from his cubs, from something else, something that was afraid but still fighting. The pack moved with practiced silence despite their size, communicating through subtle body language and pheromone releases that had been refined over thousands of generations. Vorthak took point, his massive claws finding purchase on the icy rocks as they made their way deeper into the canyon system. The walls rose on either side, creating natural windbreaks that allowed other sounds to penetrate the constant howl of the surface storms. That's when he heard it. The sound that stopped him cold and caused his entire pack to freeze in confusion. Laughter, high-pitched, innocent laughter that could only come from cubs at play. His cubs, alive, healthy, and apparently enjoying themselves. The sound echoed off the canyon walls, creating a symphony of joy that was completely at odds with what should have been a rescue mission from certain death. Vorthak's confusion deepened as they rounded a bend in the canyon and came upon a sight that challenged everything he understood about the universe. A massive cave opening gaped before them, large enough to shelter his entire pack with room to spare. But it was what lay within that froze the blood in his veins and caused several of his hunters to growl in bewilderment. His 3 cubs, each barely a meter tall and still covered in the silver-gray fur of youth, were indeed playing. They were tumbling and wrestling in the way that young Kyrathi always did, testing their strength and learning the skills they would need as adults. But they were not alone. Moving among them, participating in their games with awkward but enthusiastic grace, was a human. The creature was tiny by Kyrathi standards, barely reaching the shoulder height of his youngest cub. Its pale pink skin was mostly covered by layers of synthetic materials that Vorthak recognized as primitive thermal protection. Its face was exposed, revealing features that were simultaneously alien and strangely expressive. 2 small eyes, a protruding nose, and a mouth that was currently spread in what his limited knowledge of human behavior told him was a smile of genuine happiness. But most shocking of all was what the human was doing. As Vorthak watched in stunned silence, one of his cubs, little Shakti, stumbled and fell during a particularly enthusiastic game of pack hunt simulation. Immediately, the human rushed to her side with a speed that belied its awkward appearance. Its small hands, covered in protective coverings, gently examined Shakti's leg where she had scraped it against a rough ice formation. The human made soft sounds in its throat, musical notes that seemed to calm the injured cub immediately. From somewhere in its layers of clothing, it produced a small container and began applying something to Shakti's minor wound. The care and gentleness with which it tended to her injury was beyond anything Vorthak had ever witnessed from another species. Even among Kyrathi, cubs were expected to endure minor injuries without assistance as part of their development into strong hunters. What happened next challenged every assumption Vorthak had about the nature of predator and prey relationships. Shakti, his fierce little daughter who had never shown submission to anyone except her parents, nuzzled against the human's small form in a display of trust and affection that spoke of days or perhaps weeks of bonding. The other cubs, Morak and Thane, immediately abandoned their game and surrounded the human, their body language showing protective concern not for their injured sister, but for the small alien creature that had helped her. Vorthak's analytical mind struggled to process what he was seeing. Humans were supposed to be weak, fragile creatures from a death world called Earth. The single encounter between their species had shown them to be technologically advanced, but physically inferior to almost every other spacefaring race. They were builders and thinkers, not fighters or nurturers. Yet here was one of them, alone on one of the most hostile worlds in the galaxy, not only surviving but apparently thriving while caring for his children. The human seemed to sense his presence before any of his pack did. Its small head turned toward the cave entrance, and those tiny eyes met his across the space between them. For a moment that stretched into eternity, predator and prey regarded each other with mutual assessment. Vorthak expected to see fear, terror, the natural response of any creature faced with a pack of apex predators. Instead, he saw something that made his breath catch in his throat. Determination. The human's stance shifted almost imperceptibly, placing itself between his cubs and the cave entrance. Its small hands moved to items attached to its clothing, clearly weapons of some kind, though they appeared pitifully inadequate against creatures of their size and power. But the message was unmistakable. This tiny alien creature, this being that couldn't possibly hope to survive even a single blow from the smallest member of his pack, was prepared to fight to defend his children. The cubs noticed the change in their protector's demeanor and turned to see what had caused the shift. When they spotted their father and his hunting pack at the cave entrance, their reactions were not what Vorthak expected. Instead of running to him with relief and joy, they moved closer to the human. Not in fear, but in a protective formation that mirrored the alien's stance. His own children were prepared to defend this creature against their own father. The standoff stretched across several heartbeats as Vorthak tried to understand the impossible situation before him. His pack spread out behind him, waiting for his signal to attack or retreat. The cubs maintained their protective stance around the human, who had now produced what appeared to be a primitive projectile weapon and held it with the steady grip of someone prepared to use it despite knowing it would likely be futile. The silence was broken by Shakti, his youngest, who took a step forward and made the soft, chirping sound that cubs use to communicate with trusted adults. She was trying to tell him something, but her vocabulary was still too limited for complex concepts. However, her body language spoke volumes. She was happy, healthy, and completely unafraid. More than that, she was protective of the small alien that had apparently been caring for her. Vorthak made a decision that surprised even himself. Instead of signaling the attack that his pack expected, he slowly lowered himself into a sitting position, bringing his massive head closer to ground level. It was a gesture of non-aggression among his people, though he doubted the human would understand its significance. His pack behind him shifted uneasily, uncertain about this unprecedented development. The human watched this movement with obvious confusion but maintained its defensive posture. Its weapon remained trained on Vorthak's center mass, though both of them knew it would accomplish little against his armored hide. What impressed the Alpha was the steadiness of those small hands. The creature was terrified. He could smell its fear, but it showed no sign of backing down. Slowly, carefully, Vorthak began to speak in the trade language that most spacefaring species had adopted for intergalactic commerce. His voice, designed for long-distance communication across frozen wastelands, rumbled through the cave like distant thunder. "You protect my cubs." The human's eyes widened slightly at the use of language, but its weapon never wavered. After a moment of consideration, it responded in the same trade tongue, though its voice was high and thin compared to the deep bass of Kyrathi communication. "They needed help. I gave it." The simplicity of the statement struck Vorthak like a physical blow. No complex justification, no attempt to bargain for its life or explain away its presence. It had found his children in need and had helped them. The concept was so alien to his understanding of interspecies relationships that he struggled to find words for his next question. Why? The single word carried with it the weight of genuine confusion and the beginning of something that might have been respect. The human was quiet for so long that Vorthak began to wonder if it had understood the question. When it finally spoke, its voice carried a quality that the Alpha had never heard from any creature other than his own kind when speaking of their young. Because they're children. All children deserve protection. The statement hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Vorthak felt something shift in his chest, a recognition of a truth so fundamental that he had never thought to question it. This tiny creature, this being that his people would have dismissed as prey without a second thought, understood something about the nature of care and protection that transcended species boundaries. Behind him, his pack waited for orders that didn't come. Before him, his cubs continued their protective stance around an alien that had risked everything to keep them safe. And in that moment, Vorthak began to understand that perhaps the galaxy was far more complex than he had ever imagined. The wind continued to howl outside the cave, carrying with it the promise of storms and dangers yet to come. But inside the shelter, surrounded by ice and uncertainty, a Kyrathi pack leader found himself face to face with a truth that would change everything he thought he knew about strength, courage, and the nature of family itself. The tension in the cave remained thick as frozen air for several long moments after Vorthak's question hung unanswered. The human's weapon never wavered, though the Alpha could see the slight tremor in those small hands that spoke of exhaustion rather than fear. How long had this creature been standing guard over his cubs? How many days had it gone without proper rest while ensuring their safety? Vorthak's keen predator senses picked up details that painted a picture of dedication that bordered on the impossible. The human's clothing showed signs of recent repair, crude patches where the thermal protection had been damaged and mended with materials that clearly weren't designed for the purpose. Ice crystals clung to the synthetic fibers, suggesting multiple trips outside the shelter into the killing cold of Kithara's surface. No creature should have been able to survive such exposure repeatedly, yet here stood proof that it was possible. More telling were the subtle signs around the cave itself. The Alpha's experienced eye cataloged evidence of careful preparation and ongoing survival efforts that spoke of intelligence and planning far beyond what he had attributed to the human species. A small thermal unit hummed quietly in one corner, its design clearly alien but functional enough to provide the heat that kept his cubs comfortable. Food containers, obviously human in origin, were stacked neatly along one wall, though their numbers suggested they were nearly depleted. Most impressive was the defensive positioning the human had chosen. The cave entrance created a natural choke point, but the alien had enhanced it with carefully placed ice barriers that would funnel any attacking force into a narrow killing ground. Simple weapons were positioned at strategic points, and what appeared to be improvised explosive devices were concealed near the entrance. This tiny creature had turned a simple shelter into a fortress specifically designed to protect 3 Kirathi cubs against threats that could include their own species. "How long?" Vorthak asked, his voice softer now but still carrying the rumble of distant thunder. The human seemed to understand immediately what he was asking. 6 days, since the storm that brought them here. 6 days. Vorthak felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the planet's frigid temperature. 6 days of constant vigilance, of protecting children that weren't even the same species, of surviving on alien rations and improvised shelter while maintaining a defensive posture against threats that could appear at any moment. The dedication required was beyond anything he had witnessed in his centuries of life. Behind him, he sensed his pack's growing confusion. Their body language spoke of readiness for battle mixed with uncertainty about why their alpha hadn't yet given the command to attack. These were hunters who had followed him across star systems, warriors who trusted his judgment without question. But this situation was so far outside their experience that their normal pack dynamics were beginning to strain. Vorthak made a decision that surprised everyone in the cave, including himself. Slowly, deliberately, he began to lower his massive frame to the ice-covered floor. The motion took nearly a minute as his 4-meter height settled into a prone position that brought his head to roughly the same level as the humans. It was a posture of equality among his people, reserved for negotiations between alphas of equal standing. The gesture sent shock waves through his pack. Several hunters made involuntary sounds of confusion and alarm. In their entire culture, there was no precedent for an alpha showing such respect to a member of what they considered a prey species. But Vorthak's authority was absolute, and generations of pack hierarchy kept them in position despite their bewilderment. The human's reaction was more immediate, but equally telling. The small alien's stance shifted slightly, the weapon lowering just a fraction as it processed this unexpected development. Those tiny eyes, which Vorthak was beginning to realize were far more expressive than he had initially thought, showed a flicker of something that might have been hope mixed with continued wariness. "Your name?" Vorthak asked, the trade language feeling awkward as he tried to convey concepts that didn't translate well between species. The human hesitated for a moment before responding. "Dr. Sarah Chen, Xenobiology Specialist, Earth Colonial Survey Division." The title meant nothing to Vorthak, but the tone in which it was delivered spoke of pride and professional competence. This was not some lost explorer or unfortunate accident victim. This was a specialist, someone with knowledge and purpose who had ended up in this impossible situation through circumstances he didn't yet understand. Dr. Sarah Chen, he repeated carefully, the alien sounds difficult for his vocal apparatus to produce. You are not lost. It wasn't a question, and the human's slight smile confirmed his assessment. No, I'm exactly where I need to be. The simple statement carried implications that made Vorthak's mind race. This human hadn't stumbled upon his cubs by accident. She had positioned herself here deliberately, for reasons that were becoming increasingly intriguing. Before he could ask for clarification, little Shakti made the decision that would change everything. The young cub, barely past her first molting, detached herself from the protective formation around the human and padded slowly toward her father. Her movements were confident and healthy, showing no signs of the trauma or abuse that should have accompanied her capture by enemy forces. As she approached, Vorthak could see that her fur was clean and well-groomed, her eyes bright with intelligence and affection. But it was what she carried in her small mouth that stopped his breath entirely. Clutched carefully between her teeth was a simple object that shouldn't have existed on this frozen world. A toy. Clearly handmade from materials that had once been part of the human's equipment, it was a crude but recognizable representation of a Kirathi cub. The craftsmanship was rough but functional, and more importantly, it showed signs of extensive play and careful maintenance. Shakti dropped the toy at his massive feet and made the chittering sound that meant happiness and contentment. Then, in a display that would have melted the heart of any parent in the galaxy, she picked up the toy again and carried it back toward the human, dropping it at the small alien's feet as an offering of trust and affection. The human's response was immediate and gentle. Dr. Sarah Chen knelt down, her weapon finally lowering completely as she picked up the toy and handed it back to Shakti with obvious care. The interaction was so natural, so filled with genuine affection, that it spoke of days of bonding and shared experience that had transcended all barriers of species and biology. Vorthak's other cubs, Morak and Thane, took their sister's action as permission to approach. They moved toward their father with the easy confidence of young ones who felt completely safe and secure. But they didn't stop at his side. Instead, they positioned themselves between him and the human, their body language clearly indicating their intention to facilitate rather than separate. "Tell me," Vorthak said, his voice now carrying none of the commanding authority he normally used. "Tell me how this happened." Dr. Chen studied him for a long moment, those small eyes taking his measure with an intelligence that he was beginning to realize he had vastly underestimated. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had made decisions that would haunt or define her forever. 6 days ago, my survey team detected energy signatures consistent with a Kirathi hunting party in this system. Standard protocol required us to maintain distance and observe. We're not fighters, Dr. Vorthak. We're scientists. The use of his name, spoken with careful respect, indicated that she knew more about his species and their naming conventions than should have been possible for a casual observer. This was someone who had studied his people, who understood their culture at least superficially. But when we monitored their communications, we learned they were carrying cubs. Young ones taken in what your people call a cleansing hunt. We knew what that meant. Vorthak's ears flattened against his skull at the reference to one of the darker aspects of Kirathi culture. The cleansing hunt was an ancient tradition used to eliminate potential future challenges to pack authority. Cubs from defeated alphas were taken and abandoned in hostile territory, left to die alone as a demonstration of the new pack order. It was considered a necessary evil by most of his people, a way to prevent future wars by eliminating their source before they could mature. "You knew about the cleansing hunt," he said, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. "But you are not Kirathi. Why would you care about the fate of alien cubs?" Dr. Chen's expression hardened, and for a moment Vorthak caught a glimpse of the steel that had allowed this tiny creature to survive 6 days in one of the most hostile environments in the galaxy. Because they're children, and because I've spent my career studying your species. I know what you're capable of. The intelligence, the loyalty, the potential for greatness. I couldn't stand by and watch that potential die because of ancient traditions that serve no purpose except cruelty. The words hit Vorthak like physical blows. This human understood his people better than many Kirathi understood themselves. She had seen past the fearsome reputation and physical dominance to recognize the qualities that made his species truly great. And she had risked everything to preserve the future of 3 cubs she had never met before that moment. "The hunting party?" he asked, though he dreaded the answer. "Storm got them on the 2nd day. Emergency shelter wasn't enough against a Class 5 thermal depression. Your cubs were in an environmental suit designed for their physiology, but the system was failing when I found them." Environmental suits. Vorthak's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. The hunting party hadn't just abandoned his cubs to die slowly in the cold. They had put them in failing life support and left them to suffocate while remaining conscious until the end. It was a level of cruelty that went beyond even the harshest interpretations of the cleansing hunt traditions. "You saved them," he said, the words coming out more like a question because the concept seemed too enormous to accept at face value. "I kept them alive," Dr. Chen corrected. "They saved themselves by being exactly what you taught them to be: brave, smart, and loyal to those who show them kindness." The simple statement contained layers of meaning that would take Vorthak days to fully process. This human had not only preserved his children's lives, but had recognized their individual qualities and nurtured them. In 6 days, she had provided not just survival, but development, not just shelter, but growth. Behind him, his pack remained motionless, though he could sense their emotional state was becoming increasingly complex. Some of them were parents themselves, and the sight of healthy, happy cubs was having an effect that transcended species barriers. Others were struggling with cognitive dissonance, as everything they had been taught about predator-prey relationships clashed with the evidence before their eyes. The moment was broken by an unexpected sound from outside the cave. The distinctive howl of Kirathi in distress, carried on the wind from somewhere deeper in the canyon system. Vorthak's ears snapped to attention, his predator instincts immediately cataloging the tone and distance of the call. It was close, no more than a few hundred meters away, and it spoke of injury and desperation. Dr. Chen was on her feet instantly, her weapon back in her hands with a speed that spoke of constant vigilance. "How many in your pack?" she asked, her voice tight with tension. 20, Vorthak replied, his own attention now split between the situation in the cave and the potential threat outside. "That's 21 voices," she said, her small head tilted as she listened to calls that his own ears were only now beginning to separate and identify. "Someone else is out there." The realization hit them both at the same moment. There was another Kirathi in the canyon system, someone who wasn't part of Vorthak's hunting pack. Given the circumstances that had brought them all to this place, there were very few possibilities for who that could be, and none of them were good news for anyone involved. The howls from outside grew more urgent, and Vorthak's experienced ear identified something that made his blood freeze in his veins. The calls weren't just distress signals. They were challenge calls, the specific vocalizations used by Kirathi alphas to announce territorial claims and demand submission from rivals. Someone was coming, and they weren't interested in peaceful resolution. Dr. Chen moved with the swift efficiency of someone who had been preparing for this possibility for days. She grabbed a small device from her equipment pile and activated it, causing a low humming sound to fill the cave. "Thermal dampening field," she explained tersely. It won't hide us completely, but it'll reduce our heat signature enough to buy us some time. Vorthak watched in growing amazement as this tiny alien took charge of their defensive preparations with the skill of a veteran military commander. She gestured for his cubs to move toward the deepest part of the cave, while simultaneously checking the positioning of her improvised weapon systems. Every movement was economical and purposeful, wasting neither energy nor time. "The rival pack leader," she said, not looking at Vorthak as she worked. "The one who ordered the cleansing hunt? He survived the storm, didn't he?" The question hit Vorthak like a physical blow because he knew, with the certainty of centuries of pack politics, that she was correct. Alpha Morgoth, his longtime rival and the architect of the hunting party that had taken his cubs, was alive and tracking them. The storm that had killed his followers had been survived by the strongest among them, and now he was coming to finish what he had started. "Morgoth," Vorthak confirmed, the name emerging as a growl that echoed off the cave walls. "He leads the Ironwind pack. 12 hunters, all veterans." Dr. Chen's hands stilled for just a moment at this news before resuming their preparations. 12 plus him makes 13. Against your 20, that should be manageable. "No," Vorthak said, the weight of realization settling on his shoulders like a physical burden. "My pack came here to rescue cubs, not to fight a territory war. Half of them are scouts and trackers, not battle specialists. Against Morgoth's veterans, we're evenly matched at best." The human's expression didn't change, but he could smell the spike of adrenaline that indicated her mind was rapidly reassessing their tactical situation. When she spoke again, her voice carried the calm authority of someone who had made peace with impossible odds. "Then we make sure the fight happens on our terms, not his." Before Vorthak could ask what she meant, Dr. Chen moved to a section of the cave wall that he had assumed was simply natural rock formation. Her small hands found hidden catches and pressure points, revealing that what appeared to be solid stone was actually a carefully constructed camouflaged panel. Behind it lay a collection of equipment that made Vorthak's predatory instincts sing with appreciation. Military-grade energy weapons, obviously human in design but modified for use in extreme cold conditions. Portable shield generators that could create temporary barriers against energy fire, and most impressively, a collection of what appeared to be mining charges that had been extensively modified for combat applications. Dr. Sarah Chen, xenobiologist and supposed scientist, was also apparently a combat engineer of considerable skill. "You've been planning for this," Vorthak said, the statement carrying undertones of respect and growing understanding. "I've been planning for survival," she corrected. "When you're responsible for 3 cubs who can't defend themselves against adult predators, you plan for every contingency, including the possibility that whoever took them might come back to finish the job." The sound of approaching voices grew closer, and Vorthak could now distinguish individual pack members calling to each other as they coordinated their approach. Morgoth's tactical skills were evident in the way his surviving hunters moved through the canyon system using the natural acoustics to maintain communication while making it difficult for their quarry to determine exact positions and numbers. Dr. Chen handed Vorthak one of the modified energy weapons, and he was surprised to find that despite its alien design, it felt balanced and functional in his massive hands. "The power cells are rated for approximately 50 shots each," she explained efficiently. "Selective fire mode allows for either single shots or short bursts. The weapon is zeroed for engagements at 50 to 200 meters. The casual way she delivered this technical information while preparing defensive positions spoke of training that went far beyond civilian scientific education. Vorthak found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about human capabilities and motivations. This was no lost researcher who had stumbled into an impossible situation. This was a professional who had deliberately placed herself in harm's way to protect his children. Dr. Chen, he said, using her name with the respect due to a fellow warrior. What are you? She looked up from the explosive device she was arming, and for just a moment he saw past the careful control to the person beneath. I'm someone who believes that children deserve to grow up, regardless of what species they belong to. And I'm someone who's prepared to make sure that happens, no matter the cost. The approaching voices were now close enough that individual words could be distinguished. Morgoth's deep bass carried clearly through the canyon as he directed his pack to surround the cave system. The Alpha was taking no chances this time, employing the kind of overwhelming tactical advantage that had made him a successful pack leader for over 2 centuries. Vorthak's own pack had spread out behind him in the cave entrance, their earlier confusion replaced by the focused attention of experienced hunters facing a known threat. But he could smell their uncertainty in the air. They had come here expecting a rescue mission, not a pitched battle against one of the most dangerous alphas in the sector. Vorthak! Morgoth's voice boomed across the canyon, carrying with it all the arrogance and authority of someone who had never been successfully challenged. I know you're in there. Come out and face me properly, and I'll make your death quick. Continue to hide behind that alien's skirts, and I'll make sure you watch while I skin your cubs alive. The threat against his children sent a surge of rage through Vorthak's system that was so intense it made his vision blur red around the edges. But before he could respond, Dr. Chen placed one small hand on his massive forearm. The gesture was so unexpected and gentle that it cut through his fury like a blade through silk. Let him think we're afraid, she said quietly. Arrogance makes even the best tactical minds sloppy. And Morgoth's been successful for so long that he's forgotten what it feels like to face an opponent who's prepared for him. As if to emphasize her point, she activated another device that sent a low-frequency pulse through the cave system. To Karathi ears, it sounded like the distress calls of frightened cubs, exactly the kind of sound that would draw Morgoth's pack into the killing ground she had so carefully prepared. You're using psychology against him, Vorthak realized, his appreciation for the human's tactical skills growing exponentially. I'm using everything against him, she corrected. Superior position, prepared defenses, knowledge of his behavioral patterns, and the fact that he doesn't know what he's really walking into. The only advantage he has is numbers, and we're about to neutralize that. The first of Morgoth's scouts appeared at the canyon mouth, their forms barely visible against the ice and stone as they moved with the fluid grace of apex predators in their element. Dr. Chen tracked their movement with equipment that Vorthak didn't recognize, her small hands dancing across controls that provided her with information about enemy positions and numbers that would have taken his pack precious minutes to gather through natural senses. Confirming 13 hostiles, she murmured, her voice carrying the clipped professionalism of someone calling out battlefield intelligence. Primary Alpha and 12 veterans, all carrying standard Karathi combat gear. They're spreading out to surround us, but they're funneling into the approach routes I expected. Vorthak marveled at her composure. This tiny creature, faced with odds that would have challenged even the most experienced Karathi warriors, showed no sign of fear or hesitation. Her hands were steady, her breathing controlled, and her tactical awareness was better than many pack leaders he had known. "When do we engage?" he asked, deferring to her expertise in a way that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. "When they're committed to the attack and can't retreat easily. Patience wins more battles than courage, Dr. Vorthak." The use of his name as a title of respect, delivered while she calmly prepared to risk her life defending his children, created an emotional response in Vorthak that he had no framework for understanding. Gratitude, respect, and something deeper that transcended species boundaries combined into a feeling that made his chest tight with unfamiliar emotion. Morgoth's voice echoed through the canyon again, closer now, and filled with the confidence of a predator who believed his prey was trapped. I can smell your fear, old friend, and I can smell the alien that's been corrupting your cubs with its weakness. When this is over, I'll mount its head in my den as a reminder of what happens to species that interfere with Kirathi justice." This time, Dr. Chen didn't stop Vorthak from responding. His voice, when it emerged, carried the full authority of an alpha who had ruled through strength and wisdom for over 3 centuries. "Morgoth, you speak of justice while murdering children. You speak of strength while hiding behind numerical superiority. Face me alone if you have any honor left in your corrupted soul." The challenge rang through the canyon like a battle cry, and Vorthak felt his pack respond with the fierce joy of hunters who finally understood what they were fighting for. Behind him, his cubs moved to defensive positions with the fluid coordination that spoke of days of practice under Dr. Chen's patient instruction. "Honor?" Morgoth's laughter was like breaking ice. "Honor is for species strong enough to enforce it. Your human pet will learn the difference before I'm done with her." That was when Dr. Chen made her move. The modified mining charges she had positioned throughout the approach routes detonated simultaneously, sending tons of ice and rock cascading down to block the primary exit routes and trap Morgoth's pack in a confined space where their numerical advantage became a liability rather than an asset. "Now," she said simply, and opened fire with a weapon that sent coherent energy beams lancing through the dust and debris to find targets with deadly accuracy. The battle that followed would become legend among the Kirathi, told in hunting lodges and pack dens for generations to come. It was the day that Alpha Vorthak and a human scientist stood side by side against overwhelming odds to protect 3 cubs who represented the future of 2 species. It was the day that courage transcended biology and family became something bigger than blood or genetics. But more than anything else, it was the day that Vorthak learned that strength came in forms he had never imagined, and that the greatest predators in the galaxy were not always the ones with the biggest claws or the most powerful bodies. Sometimes, they were the ones with the biggest hearts and the clearest understanding of what was truly worth fighting for. As energy beams lit up the canyon and the sound of battle echoed across the frozen landscape, 3 young cubs watched from their safe position and learned lessons about courage, sacrifice, and the bonds that could unite any species when faced with a common enemy. And in that cave, surrounded by ice and fury, a new understanding was born that would eventually spread across the galaxy and change forever how the great powers viewed the small blue world called Earth. The pack leader had arrived at the Icebound den expecting to find his children in need of rescue. Instead, he found them in the care of someone who had already given them everything he could have hoped for and more: protection, care, love, and most importantly, proof that the universe was far more complex and wonderful than he had ever dared to imagine.